Hello, my name is Rachel Needell, and I am an English master's student at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And today I will be discussing my paper, Internalizing the Panoptic Condition, Visibility and Observation in Macbeth. So scholars and critics as early as the 18th century have remarked on the frightening visages of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. Gildon, in his remarks on the plays of Shakespeare, felt it unfit for praise as, quote, the character of Macbeth and his lady are too monstrous for the stage. But what is this monstrousness that Gildon describes? Ultimately, it can be assumed that this monstrousness stems from their delinquency and evil acts. Macbeth and his lady lie so far outside of the accepted social norms that their portrayal on stage becomes subject to judgment. 18th century scholar William Smith on Macbeth's dagger speech claims, quote, his eyes rebel against his reason and makes him start at images that have no reality. Even these early scholars were conscious of the power of visibility and the implications of seeing throughout the play. Smith's quote illuminates the ways in which visibility and what is visible rebels against Macbeth. The eye turns inward and enacts examination upon itself, the Foucauldian disciplinary power of observation. According to Foucault, the success of disciplinary power relies on three elements: hierarchical observation, normalizing judgment, and examination. Through observation and visibility, Macbeth positions himself within the play as a delinquent, obsessing over his abnormal behavior. This focus on his delinquency also works to situate him as an apt subject for discipline and punishment. Macbeth deviates from accepted social norms through the crimes he commits and the actions he takes in an attempt to master power itself. This abnormality works to portray him as a delinquent, and disciplinary measures within the play create a penalty of the norm. In this way, he sets himself up for hierarchical observation and examination. Macbeth struggles to cope with the possibility of being seen or visible. The insurmountable fear of his thoughts and crimes being surveilled is almost wholly responsible for his downfall. This can be seen through the repeated use of verbs like to look and to see throughout the play, particularly in soliloquies devoted to espousing guilt, shame, and fear of discovery concerning his crimes. There is a deliberate focus on the visible, what is seen, who is seeing, and who may see in the future. However, I argue that the discovery of his crimes by others carries less weight than his own observations and examinations of himself. It is not the visibility of his crimes to others that is responsible for his downfall. In fact, it is his paranoia of visibility, the fear of being seen, that compels him to make choices and decisions that ultimately lead to his own tragic end. It is his own internalized visibility of himself and his true nature that leads to his undoing. In sum, Macbeth has internalized the panoptic condition and become his own judge, enacting the disciplinary power of examination onto himself that makes it possible to qualify, classify, and punish. So, Macbeth's delinquency and guilt have faced much discussion over the centuries. Many scholars and critics often point out that there has been a certain amount of pity or remorse in the reception of Macbeth, seeing him as a good natured man moved to evil by external influences. T.W., writing in the British magazine in the mid 18th century, asserted that if the chief end of tragedy be to excite terror and compassion, that of Macbeth must be allowed to surpass all others, whether ancient or modern. This early reception concerning the compassion that seems to accompany the disgust and terror of the character of Macbeth is particularly interesting and continues to bear weight within scholarship today. Audiences are moved to sympathy because of Macbeth's guilt and subsequent punishment, and this leads to a sort of confusion surrounding his guilt. 20th century Shakespearean scholar A.C. Bradley claims that Macbeth is distinguished by his imagination, and through it especially come to him the intimations of conscience and honor, an assertion this paper agrees with. However, he then goes on to say that, quote, Macbeth's better nature, to put the matter for clearness' sake too broadly, instead of speaking to him in the overt language of moral ideas, commands, and prohibitions, incorporates itself in images which alarm and horrify. Hazlitt, an early 19th century critic whose work influenced Bradley and provides further contextualization for the historical precedent of Bradley's views, claims that unlike Richard III, Macbeth is cruel from, quote, accidental circumstances rather than nature and driven to criminal acts by a, quote, conspiracy of fate or a metaphysical aid, creating for him a, quote, evil destiny he cannot escape. But is it his better nature or the action of examination that produces his horrifying hallucinatory guilt? In contrast with Bradley and Hazlitt, I argue that Macbeth is not innocent by nature. In fact, to view Macbeth as a victim of the witches or even of Lady Macbeth, as many scholars have also claimed, is to view him as lacking agency or control over his own actions, and positions the witches and Lady Macbeth as proverbial Eves, luring Macbeth into tragedy and sin. This effectively alleviates Macbeth of any personal culpability for his own actions and decisions. I argue that the guilt he feels is not a demonstration of Bradley's idea of some hidden better nature or even Hazlitt's conception of accidental circumstance, but instead is a consequence of the internalized panoptic condition, a penalty of the norm, functioning to punish and train, as is the aim of the Foucauldian theorization of institutions. So this speech, its location in the play, and its timing directly following the first of the witches' prophecies coming to fruition, is definitive and unambiguous. Located early on, before he has even committed any actual crimes, he is already situating himself as a delinquent, demonstrating the effects of examination turned inward. He admits outright that his treasonous plan is his deep desire. There is a specific focus on visibility, quote, let not light see, quote, the eye wink at the hand, and light functions as the most vital instrument in the perfect disciplinary apparatus, which would, quote, make it possible for a single gaze to see everything constantly. A central point would be both the source of light illuminating everything and a locus of convergence for everything that must be known, a perfect eye that nothing would escape, and a center towards which all gazes would be turned. So, whether this gaze is interpreted as God's, the audience, or his own, the panoptic condition still normalizes and enacts judgment as punishment, which Macbeth displays as tormenting guilt and fear. He even references the concept of an ever watchful eye, which he mentions twice in the speech, quote, yet let that be which the eye fears when it is done to see. The eye, or his own, he claims is terrified to look upon the crime he plans to commit, to see in all illuminating light the person who would take that action. And fascinatingly, he speaks directly to this watchful eye, pleading with it to look away as he commits regicide. But an internalized eye is inescapable. He cannot look away from himself. He therefore, along with the watchful gaze of the audience members, cannot help but to judge and be judged. In this way, the play itself functions as the perfect disciplinary apparatus, where all Macbeth's misdeeds and mistakes are illuminated in bright light, a locus of conversion where everything must be known, and Macbeth, our star, cannot hide his fires, as he is the center towards which all eyes are constantly turned. So, this is the dagger speech, and the dagger speech is particularly interesting because it calls up many references to what is visible and the act of seeing, focused specifically in relation to the dagger itself. And this is the first time that Macbeth's internalized panoptic condition manifests as an outward expression of his inner judgment, but it's not the last. The dagger functions as a witness to his crimes and a physical manifestation of his crime even before he has committed it. However, it also works the other way as well. Macbeth, in this quiet state of reflection before he fully resigns himself to evil, is able to preemptively enact observational judgment, the dagger as a metaphor for the murder, as well as who he is about to become. Once again, there's a concern with visibility, what and who is being seen. Macbeth sees the dagger. Is this a dagger which I see before me? Although it is not visible to others, much like the way that disciplinary power is exercised. Quote, I have thee not, and yet I see thee still. Art thou not fatal vision, sensible to feeling as to sight? And the vision is fatal because it is a moment of examination. Macbeth looks upon the dagger and sees himself. And the dagger is a beacon that lights the way towards his murderous destiny. And this is one that he's currently resigning to follow. As Macbeth experiences the internalized panoptic condition by manifesting his crimes as visible images or apparitions, he becomes the watchful eye and gazes upon himself. He says, "Mine eyes are made the fools over all other senses, or else worth all the rest." It is either that what he is seeing is a fantasy or that it is some kind of true vision. Then he notices the blood on his blade, which insinuates guilt, the crime having been already committed. Quote, "I see thee still, and on thy blade and dudgeon gouts of blood, which was not so before." This signifies a consequence of the internalized panoptic condition. He has thought too long and too deeply on these evil acts that he can no longer view himself as innocent. He resigns himself to delinquency. He believes himself to be a criminal, so he will be, as is the functioning of the carceral system that Foucault proposes. The bloody dagger of the mind becomes a prophetic metaphor, and Macbeth must gaze upon his hands and see himself for who he truly is, who he has now become. One of the scenes that most aptly demonstrates Macbeth's internalized panoptic condition, manifesting as an outward vision symbolic of his inner judgment, is the appearance of Banquo's ghost, a moment that has been largely overlooked in scholarship. Act 3, Scene 4, the feast begins directly following Banquo's murder. The stage directions heavily indicate an emphasis on the actor's seeing of the ghost not simply an elusive presence that is felt, but one that is actually seen. In this state of death, Banquo's accusatory and omniscient gaze functions like the central tower of the panopticon, a perfect eye that nothing can escape, and Macbeth at the center towards which all gazes would be turned. But because Macbeth has internalized the panoptic condition, Banquo's ghost functions as another guilt induced hallucination, aimed at facilitating Macbeth's own examination upon himself. Banquo's ghost sits in the state chair, the place reserved for the king. He is physically taking the place of the king, which references the initial prophecy and the one that Macbeth is so intensely fixated on in this moment. He watches as Banquo takes his place, and Banquo watches him back. Gazing at Macbeth, and through his gaze, he is able to discipline Macbeth and effectively strip him of his power. When seeing that Banquo's ghost occupies his place at the table, Macbeth says that the table is full. With the observational power of Banquo's gaze, Macbeth can no longer hide from his fears concerning his true nature, one that makes him unsuited to be king. And he metaphorically cannot see a place for himself at the table or a place for him in the world, which works to once again reinforce his delinquency. For all the murders Macbeth commits, I argue the murder of Banquo carries even greater weight. It is the most personal of all the murders, and it is the one that transitions Macbeth from an opportunist killer to a calculated and crazed child murderer. When Banquo sees Macbeth, Macbeth sees himself. In this way, Banquo's ghost doesn't need to be alive and produce heirs, or even to physically fight Macbeth to strip him of his crown. His spiritual presence is a corporeal decoronation, quite literally, as Macbeth strips himself of any kingly authority. This speech pleads with the gaze of Banquo to look away, to hide himself away in the same way that Macbeth attempts to hide his crimes. But because no one but Macbeth can see the ghost, Macbeth's pleading is with the ghost to hide away from his own sight or to hide his true nature from himself. Banquo's invisible ghost, with an omniscient and ever watchful gaze, is a metaphor for disciplinary power that is exercised through its invisibility. Banquo's ghost is an employed vehicle of observational power arising from Macbeth's own internalized panoptic condition. Banquo is Macbeth as Macbeth's judge, and in passively observing Macbeth, he actively strips him of his power. So, in conclusion, the power of observation and seeing work throughout the play to normalize and discipline. There's a palpable and tangible fear that arises within Macbeth surrounding his visibility, whether it is the visibility of his crimes to others, the fear of what is being seen, or most importantly, his fear of seeing himself. But it is the internalization of this visibility, the eye that turns inward, the examination of himself, which ultimately leads Macbeth to his tragic fate. This fate is made all the more tragic when audiences consider how many times throughout the play Macbeth had the opportunity to turn back to make the right decision, yet he does not. And this reveals his true nature, one that is corrupt and treasonous, willing to murder his enemies, friends, and even the king, the ultimate crime, in order to achieve his own ends and, crucially, to avoid seeing himself for who he truly is. Goldman states that Macbeth is a man of action, but he is a man of action afflicted by the normalizing gaze. We only see Macbeth falter in his convictions when he speaks. But through his actions, we can see a very different image, and so too does the ever watchful eye. Thank you.